Hey guys, Wes here with Rocky Mountain, and today I'm going to show you how to install the Modquad Lockout Clutch Cover Set on the Yamaha Banshee. Alright guys, so if you have a Banshee or if you've been around them, you know that they're super popular to mod. The aftermarket for these things is huge. And one of the first things that people like to mod is the engine. And increasing horsepower and all that is great, but your stock clutch or your clutch system has to take all that abuse, and that's where this kit comes in. So there's two parts of the Modquad kit that I want to cover, and the first is the lockout piece. So you can see I've got it right here. It actually just mounts right onto your clutch pack, and there's a couple different benefits that you're going to get from this thing. So the way it works is it uses centrifugal force. So as your motor is spinning and your RPMs increase, that's going to make these things fold out and put more pressure on your clutch pack. So the benefits that you get from that is because there's more pressure on your clutch pack, it's going to rob less power and you're going to be able to put that horsepower to the ground. The other things that it's going to do is because your clutch is not slipping as much, it's going to make your clutch last longer. Another benefit of it, and the way this thing works, is during the lower RPMs, it's not going to add any pull weight to your clutch bowl. So your clutch is still going to be very usable when you're in those lower RPMs. All right, so the next piece I want to talk about is the clutch cover. Now, the biggest benefit you're going to get from this thing is it's full billet aluminum. So it's way stronger than your stock cast material and even some aftermarket clutch covers as well. So one of the big downfalls of a cast clutch cover is with the extra horsepower and compression that some of these engines have, it's going to take more effort to kick them over. And sometimes your cover can break or crack in that area. You're not going to run into that with this billet aluminum cover. And you can see with the looks, chrome finish, they've got different colorways here, and it's really going to complement our Banshee build. So this kit's going to fit 1987 Banshees all the way up to 2006, and I'm going to show you how to get it installed. So the parts we're going to need for this install are obviously the kit components. We are draining the coolant and draining the oil, so I've got an engine oil change kit. We also need a new clutch cover gasket, and I've got a water pump rebuild kit that comes with a new bearing, seal, and outer cover gasket. You are going to want a new kickstarter seal. This is from our bottom end rebuild kit because we just barely did that. You can pick these things up on our OEM diagrams on the website. And this is optional, but we picked up a chrome dipstick to complement our cover. The tools you're going to want for this job are some basic hand tools. We've also got a torque wrench, a gasket scraper, an impact driver, and a spring puller. And then we've got a drain pan, some gloves, safety glasses, contact cleaner, and most importantly, we've got our service manual that we need for those torque specs. So the first thing we need to do is basically just gain access to the clutch cover. So any parts that are in the way of that, you're going to have to remove. For us, that's going to be our foot peg, the Nerf bar, the brake pedal, and the kickstarter. All right, so the next step is to drain the coolant. Now, since we're only partially draining the coolant, we're just going to pull this hose right here and catch everything that we can. Now, if you're wanting to completely replace the coolant in your Banshee, there is bolts, drain bolts on both cylinders, and you'll want to pull both of those as well as all the hoses. The next step is to drain the transmission oil, and we do that by removing the drain plug underneath the engine. So the next step is to gain access to the water pump. So to do that, we're going to remove this outer cover and the inner cover. Now, surprisingly, all these Phillips head screws are actually in pretty good shape. They're usually pretty stripped out by this point. But the tools that you want to use is a number 3 Phillips that actually fits it correctly. But our go-to for these things is an impact driver. And these are super helpful for not stripping out the screws, and we're going to use these same tools for the clutch cover bolts as well. Now, as we loosen the water pump ones, I'm going to pull my coolant drain pan back over so I can catch any other coolant that's going to drain out of here. So this is a perfect example of stripping these screws out. So you can see this one's pretty buggered up. It's a perfect time to use our impact driver. And that backed it right out. The next step is to disconnect our breather hose. Now stock, it's going to come out of this case cover and up to a T about right here. So if your Banshee is stock, you're going to want to disconnect it at that T and then move on to removing the clutch cover. Ours is just routed up the frame, so we backed it out and now we're ready to remove the clutch cover. There's 9 bolts that hold this on, and again, we're going to be using our impact driver to remove each of these. So now I've got all the hardware removed, we can go ahead and pull the clutch cover. So we've brought the stock cover over to the workbench, and now we're ready to transfer the water pump assembly into our new clutch cover. So to do that, there's a small circlip. I've just got a small screwdriver that we're going to use to remove that. So we've got that off. There's a washer. We can slide our water pump gear off. And then there's a small pin that slides through that, and that's what holds this all together. Now we should be able to slide the water pump out the other side. All right, so now that we actually have a new water pump repair kit, we don't need to do anything with the bearing in here or the seal underneath it. Now real quick, before we install the new seal and bearing, I'm gonna pull this outer cover just so we can get another look at what's going on. All right, so now we're ready to install our new seal and our new bearing from our Tusk water pump kit. Now before we start, I've found the correct size sockets for the outer diameter of the seal and the bearing, so we can drive both of those in. And real quick, I want to explain the direction of the seal. So the flat side, the more flat side is going to face the center of the motor. That's going to be facing up as the clutch cover lies. There's a deeper concave on the other side, and that's going to face down, or the outside of the motor, the exterior. So before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and use a little seal grease and grease this thing up. Pull sides of the inside, and then I want to grease up the outside, make it a little easier to slide into place. So now I've got my seal already kind of set in place and pushed into place as well as I can. I've got my socket, I'm going to set directly over that, support the rest of the case cover, and go ahead and hammer it into place. So once you're done driving the seal, you can go ahead and flip the case half over and inspect it from the other side. And once it's seated against this side, you know it's driven far enough. So now we're ready to drive our bearing into place. So I'm going to grease up the outside, make it a little easier to drive into place. And we can set that right there for now. And then I've found this piece of wood that we can use to support the clutch cover, because we need something solid to hit against. So now I can support that. You can see it supporting the clutch cover pretty good. Set this socket there, and we'll give her a couple whacks. And you'll know the bearing is driven all the way. When you hear that change of pitch, that means it's bottoming out. The next step is to install the kickstarter seal, and we're doing this while the clutch cover is laying flat on a flat table. It's going to make it easier to get the seal installed. So I'll go ahead and grease up the outside and the inside while we're at it, and then we'll push it into place. Now we're ready to reinstall our water pump assembly. So I'm going to put a little grease on it before we do that, and we'll slide it in. Be careful, because you don't want to compromise the oil seal that we just installed. Push that all the way up into place, and then the pin can be installed after that. Slide that in, and then we can install our water pump gear. And before I do that, you can see there's 2 places that it can be indexed. And so you just want to make sure that it snaps down into place. Then we can install the washer and our circlip. Now that we've got our water pump installed, the next step is to install the water pump cover gasket and the cover. So we've got our supplied water pump cover gasket. You have to line that up and then install these bolts. So now we're done with the clutch cover, we can move on to installing the lockout. So first thing we need to do is remove all 6 pressure plate bolts. And I'm going to do that with a 10mm wrench. Loosen these in a star pattern. And once you get them all loose, go ahead and pull the bolts. We're going to leave the springs in place. All right, so to install the lockout, we're gonna take the 6 provided bolts with the kit and we're gonna slide those into the lockout and then line it up with the spring and clutch pack on the machine. After you get all the bolts started, go ahead and tighten everything down in a star pattern so the lockout gets sucked down evenly. Now, as you're tightening down the bolts on the lockout, make sure that none of the fingers get stuck underneath it. They all need to be facing out. Once you get all those snugged, we're going to go ahead and torque each of these bolts to the stock torque spec, which is 7.2 foot-pounds. So now that we have the lockout completely installed and torqued to spec on our clutch pack, we're just about ready to reinstall our clutch cover. But before we do that, we're going to replace the clutch cover gasket as well as inspect and or replace the O-ring on the coolant port here. If you need a new O-ring, you can find that on the OEM diagrams on our website. So this clutch cover gasket hasn't been on this engine for very long, so it came off in one piece, pretty clean. You can see that the gasket mating surface is already pretty clean, so we don't have to do a whole lot. Yours might have left some old gasket behind that you'll want to go through, and you can use a gasket scraper tool to clean that off, and then we're just going to use some contact cleaner and rag to make sure our surface is super clean before we go back together. Okay, so now we have our new Tusk clutch cover gasket. We can go ahead and install this into place, and it's going to slide over this dowel pin back here in the back and the coolant port, and those two parts will hold it into place as we install the clutch cover. So now we can take our new clutch cover and carefully slide it into place. Now, if you're lucky, the water pump gears will line right up and the cover will go right on. If they don't, then you may have to remove the water pump cover so you can spin the water pump slightly to get those gears to mesh. If the clutch cover doesn't go right on all the way the first time, don't force it with the bolts. Don't suck it down. You want to make sure that you get everything lined up perfectly, so the cover should just slide right on. Grab your clutch cover hardware and install each bolt through the hole and carefully thread it into the case. There is one longer bolt that will go in the top left corner through the dowel pin. After we get all of them finger tight, we're going to torque each bolt in a crisscross pattern to 7.2 foot-pounds. All right, so now that we've got our clutch cover installed, we can finish up with the motor. I need to reinstall the drain plug and I'll torque that to 14 foot-pounds. After that, I can reconnect our coolant hose, tighten that hose clamp down, and then we can add our fresh oil and new coolant. After that, we just need to reinstall any parts that we previously removed to finish up this install. So real quick, guys, I want to point something out with this new clutch cover. So because the larger capacity and the extra distance that this sticks out over the stock cover, that causes us to need to make a few adjustments. So the brake pedal first, you can see how close it is sitting to the clutch cover. We had to adjust it down a little bit so it doesn't come up and hit the new clutch cover as we're using it. The other thing that I want to point out is this foot peg. So this is the stock foot peg. I've already removed the Nerf bar, obviously, but it also sits really close to the new clutch cover. So to get around that, you're either going to need to use the included spacers or just some washers behind the foot peg to space that out far enough to avoid interference with the new clutch cover. All right, guys, so now all we got to do is start the machine up and make sure everything's in good working order. We're also going to check for leaks and make sure that it isn't leaking anywhere. And that's all there is to installing the Modquad Lockout Clutch Cover Set. Now, if you guys have any questions about anything we did today, comment below and we'll be sure and get back to you. Now, if you guys want to see all the parts and accessories that we added to this thing, make sure and check out that machine build. And if you guys haven't already, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.